Okay guys, for the respiratory system notes, we're going to go through this much the same way we did the digestive system, in that we're going to go through pretty quickly and sort of outline the notes instead of going through too much detail, except for when we have to. And so this will be serving as kind of more of a review, but I guess it depends on when you look at material, whether it's a review or intro, but here we go. Here are the general functions of the lungs. The one thing that kind of stands out here is that the general function of the lungs is not gas exchange. That's specifically the job of the alveoli and the membranes, membrane that is at that level that we'll get to. So releasing oxygen, getting oxygen, sense of smell, and regulating blood pH. Here are the two parts, upper and lower. You should know which organs are where, which parts are in which division. Here are the upper respiratory organs. You know all of these and pretty much their function. We've talked about them before. The mucous membrane has basically three jobs: trapping particles, warming the air, and moistening the air, which as it gets into the lungs further down, it's just a little more functional if it's matching the conditions within instead of coming in really cold and dry. If you've ever gone running in cold and dry air, it's painful. Paranasal sinuses, we've kind of already seen these structures before. They have mucous membranes, which are helpful, as we just discussed. The pharynx, which is the passageway for air into the lungs. The larynx, which is the voice box containing the vocal cords. There's the hyoid bone, which is the only bone in your body that is not connected to another bone or muscle. This is preventing objects from entering the trachea that do not belong, like food or liquids. This is the location of the vocal cords. Here are some more of the parts to the larynx. The vocal cords, there are true and false vocal cords. True vocal cords are the ones that are actually vibrating, producing the sound. Here are some more important parts, especially when it comes to closing up the trachea so that wrong things do not go down there. The glottis is the opening, which closes when we swallow. The epiglottis covers the opening, so further prevention of foreign objects from entering the airways for obvious reasons. Trachea is the windpipe. It consists of all these cartilage rings that you can see. Trachea is based off the design of the vacuum, right? It's the opposite. Hose is based off the design of the trachea. Perfect anatomy to keep the airways open. It's cartilaginous rings. Bronchial tree, which again the division from the trachea is primary bronchi, secondary tertiary, and then bronchioles, which are the very super small, 0.5 to 1 millimeter across tubes that will eventually lead into the alveoli, which are little spheres of gas exchange. Here's a diagram going over basically the exact same thing in the previous page, just an easier way to memorize. Here's a really good picture of basically the alveolar duct, which is the tube leading into the alveolar sac, which is all of these little alveoli, which are where all the gas exchange takes place. Here gives you an idea of how the capillary is involved, venules and arterioles coming in and out. If you are an athlete or a musician, someone who's in need of more oxygen more often, then you're going to have more capillaries than at this location. You're going to have more capillaries than someone that is not. Bronchioles, which are the smallest tubes that are lined with smooth muscle. Smooth muscle's job is to control dilation and constriction of these airways. If the smooth muscles spasm, that is an asthmatic attack. You can talk to someone that has asthma and how scary of an experience that can be. That's the spasm of these muscles, which are causing tubes to constrict when they really shouldn't be. And again, the alveoli or alveoli, depending on your preference, lined with epithelial cells. This is the location of gas exchange. There's two basic important things here in the lungs that we need to talk about. And there, so the linings, the very inner lining is the the visceral pleura, and the outer lining is the parietal pleura. There may or may not be space in between. There is fluid in there. That fluid is pretty watery, and if you've ever stuck a microscope under the microscope, you put a slide cover on top of a microscope slide that has some fluid on there. It's kind of hard to get that microscope slide cover and the cover slip off. And that is because of the surface tension that water provides. And so fluid between these two linings is important so that these two linings basically act as one because of that surface tension that's in there. Okay, so visceral on the inside, IV, everyone knows what an IV is, right? Inside visceral, it's an easy way to think of it. PO, parietal, outside PO box. And then here's that serous fluid. Helps to lubricate, but also helps to keep those membranes together. So as one is as the parietal membrane is being pulled on, the visceral membrane follows right up behind it to cause breathing. And here are the two parts of breathing. Inspiration is due to lots of things. Diaphragm, ribs, muscles that are surrounding here, even additional muscles that can do forceful inhalation. The reason the air moves into the lungs is because of a slight difference in atmospheric pressure, which you'll see in just a little bit. The alveoli at rest are at 760 millimeters of mercury. During inspiration, air is going to move in, most importantly oxygen. It's going to cause a decrease in pressure by 2 millimeters, so it's not much of a difference. But we'll see that in a second. The chest cavity, thoracic cavity, is based on a vacuum. And so if you can imagine, sort of pulling on the chest outwards is going to cause everything on the inside to expand, forcing air in, which basically that pulling takes place by the diaphragm contracting, and as it contracts, it moves downwards. Which, again, a vacuum, if you make more space on the inside, air is going to move in. And then the opposite is true. Just reverse that. The diaphragm relaxes. Organs push back up on the lungs, and so, basically like squeezing a balloon. Another way to remember this, in a weird way, vacuum, talking about the vacuum, is if someone's choking on something, you're putting forceful contractions on the rib cage, which is causing the lungs to contract pretty forcefully and force air out to hopefully dislodge whatever is caught in the airway. There are also intercostal muscles, which we saw a long time ago in the muscle unit between the ribs that are contracting. Diaphragm is contracting. All this is causing to decrease the pressure, and if you decrease the pressure, it's going to cause air to come in, fill up all the space as much as possible to increase the chances of oxygen coming in and getting to the tissues. Again, the lungs are expanding because of these membranes, as I just mentioned. Membranes being pulled outwards, so the lungs get bigger, means air comes in. Here's a difference in atmospheric pressure, or difference between the atmosphere and the alveoli at rest versus during inspiration. You can see during inspiration, the alveoli are slightly less pressurized, and so that's what's going to increase the chances of air coming in. It's just gas loss stuff. So lower pressure in the lungs, higher pressure in the atmosphere causes the air to come in. We'll talk about some alveoli anatomy, but one of the most important things here is the surfactant that's being secreted by the type 2 cells that is going to decrease the surface tension, which means these microscopic little spheres are not going to stick to each other. If you've ever pulled a balloon out of a drawer or something that's been sitting for a while, that balloon latex kind of starts to stick to itself, and so that balloon is maybe stuck closed. And so that's kind of a way to think about that. If you were to fill that balloon up with a little bit of soap, those the latex membranes are going to separate from each other and allow air to come in. Same is true for these alveoli, as they are secreting surfactant, which is basically a kind of a soapy-like compound that's going to decrease the chances of all of these little spheres, little air pockets, from basically collapsing on themselves. One thing that we should mention, just because we're talking about it a lot of times, the big danger of premature babies is because their lungs have not developed, and what that means is the lack of the surfactant that I just mentioned. Without the surfactant, the air just basically cannot get in, or as much cannot get in as these organisms need. And so obviously the danger here is not enough oxygen to the tissues, primarily the brain. And so, things are pretty drastic in the case of a baby as small as a doctor's pen. Kind of a sad picture, but thankfully science has figured out ways to increase the odds of these babies surviving. And so it takes a lot of technology and a lot of know-how, but it works. So for a deep breath, continuing on the inspiration and almost completing, deep breath is just more contraction. Your rib muscles and also the diaphragm. For expiration, everything is just kind of going back to normal for the most part. Relaxation is the easy part. So diaphragm relaxes, intercostals relax, ribs are going to contract a little bit after being expanded, and so air is going to come out. Pretty simple. So the muscles relax, intercostal muscles, also the diaphragm, and something else that's happening in the microscopic level is the surface tension at the alveoli are actually decreasing their size, and so air, even at that smallest level, is coming out. Sometimes you hear about this stuff on the news or medical shows where someone has a collapsed lung again, and everything's based on a vacuum. And so as soon as you ruin the vacuum effect, you have air introduced to the space where there shouldn't be air. The lung's not going to function properly or at all because it's relying on that vacuum to expand and contract. So introduction of air into that space in the thoracic cavity, that part of the thoracic cavity, basically causes the lungs to stop functioning correctly because they are based on a vacuum system. Deep or a forceful exhale would be flexing or contracting the internal intercostals. There's the difference between internal and external, but everything else is just relaxing a little bit more, but contracting muscles and the abdomen, internal intercostals is going to force more air to come out than is normal. Controlling breathing is going to start wrapping up the end of the notes. We have to talk about something that we've already mentioned in the nervous system, and that is just regular, involuntary, rhythmic breathing. And that is because of the brainstem. And hopefully this brings back some positive memories of the nervous system. Controlling things like heartbeat and breathing is because of the brainstem. That this is all involuntary control. The respiratory centers, and we'll talk about basically two major areas, rhythmicity area and pneumotaxic area. We'll focus a little bit more attention on the rhythmicity area. There are two groups, a dorsal respiratory group, and this just refers to the location in the brainstem. This is controlling rhythmic breathing, so dorsal is rhythmic breathing, just normal breathing. And ventral is active during forceful breathing, so there's a difference between these two. Ventral is forceful, dorsal is just rhythmic, involuntary breathing. And then the pneumotaxic area is basically helping or inhibiting the dorsal respiratory group, so changing the signal basically to change the breathing rate. For instance, if you increase the impulses to the pneumotaxic area, it's going to increase the breathing rate, and then if you decrease the impulses, you're decreasing the breathing rate. And here it just shows you the locations. I'm not going to ask you on the test, but just so you can see the dorsal group. This is obviously over here on the right side is the posterior part of the brain. And so dorsal is towards the back, ventral is towards the front. Other things that are affecting breathing Um, respiratory areas are sensitive to chemicals, and that one of the things we're talking about is for affecting breathing is the carbon dioxide levels that are picked up in the cerebral spinal fluid. By the way, CSF, if you've forgotten, cerebral spinal fluid picks up changes in carbon dioxide, and this is going to affect the breathing rate. So increasing the signals to increase the breathing rate, and then of course decreasing signals is going to cause a decrease in breathing rate. The sort of other end of the spectrum is detecting oxygen levels, and that is done by the carotid and aortic bodies, which are located in locations that you probably would assume. Knowing about the cardiovascular system, I'm not going to ask you where these are located, I'm just going to ask you what they're detecting. But here's the aorta, aortic arch, so you can see aortic bodies, which are just specialized cells to transmit and pick up signals, detect, stretch. And carotid bodies up at the carotid artery, so where you would expect them. But basically here they are detecting low blood oxygen levels, whereas cerebral spinal fluid is picking up carbon dioxide levels, so opposites. Inflation reflex, which is basically exactly what it sounds, the enlarging of the lung tissue because of stretch. The one thing that this is helpful for is to prevent overinflation. If you've ever taken a super deep breath or maybe had air forced into your lungs, it can be painful, and any kind of pain like that is necessary for evolution because it's preventing perhaps damage to the tissue. Emotions also affect breathing, crying, laughing, hyperventilation, which in cases of extreme anxiety, nervousness, it's when hyperventilation takes place, and what this does is lowering CO2 levels, but also raising oxygen levels. So this is your trick to holding your breath longer. Probably the most important part of the respiratory system are these guys, the microscopic spheres that are in charge of gas exchange. There are two types of cells. The type 1 form the wall, basically forming the outer layer. And then type 2, which are, can't tell from the picture, one of these two. These little green, the white ones, secreting surfactant. And then the green ones here, we're saying, are the macrophages, which are, of course, in charge of digesting any foreign bodies, bacteria, dust, pollen, something that gets in that shouldn't be there. Respiratory membrane, you kind of saw some of this anatomy on the WebQuest. I'm not going to go over too much of that, but here's a good diagram that there's a lot here, but again, it shows you the importance of the alveolus. Its job in gas exchange with the capillary, which we've gone over in some detail on worksheets and animations, so I don't want to go too much into this stuff, but again, diffusion and basically the cause for gases to move is because of the difference in pressure, gas pressure, atmospheric pressure, partial pressure, which is mentioned a lot in these animations, partial pressure, which is basically the way of describing the overall pressure of air. Most importantly, oxygen and carbon dioxide that's in the lungs and capillaries. So again, stuff that we've kind of already seen. Gas is going in, exchanging with the capillaries. So numbers we've already seen. Movement of carbon dioxide from the blood to the alveoli, and then movement of oxygen from an alveolar wall through the alveolar wall to the blood, to the capillaries, to the tissues. Oxygen is traveling on hemoglobin. This goes back to our blood unit. Some of it's dissolving in the plasma. There are three ways that the blood is transporting carbon dioxide. Again, we've kind of already talked about some of this. We talked about bicarbonate in the blood unit because that's the biggest way carbon dioxide is traveling. Some of it's dissolved in plasma, bound to hemoglobin, but most of it's traveling as a bicarbonate ion. So let's go over how bicarbonate ion is formed, which is pretty simple. Here's the protein that's carrying carbon dioxide on a red blood cell. But basically, here's how bicarbonate's made. First, it's turned into carbonic acid by combining with water. So you get H2CO3. There's an enzyme that speeds up the reaction. And then naturally, the bicarbonate splits into hydrogen ions, which go off to, which bind to the hemoglobin, and bicarbonate, which is just going to travel through the plasma and then eventually get expelled out the lungs through alveoli, bronchioles, and through the trachea out the body. And here's just kind of some, going back to the carbon dioxide stuff, releasing the CO2 out into the atmosphere.